Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is grind. Let's take a look at some of the definitions or ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear grind used is to mean to reduce something to small particles by crushing it. With this first definition, my mind immediately goes to coffee, and that's largely because I love having a cup of coffee each morning. Sometimes when I buy coffee from the grocery store, the supermarket, it comes in bean form. Right? And the beans need to be crushed or reduced to small particles before I can brew coffee. A second way you might hear grind used is to mean to sharpen, smooth, or produce something by friction. So, with friction, think of things rubbing together. A third way you might hear grind used is to mean to press together with a rotating motion. A fourth way the verb grind gets used is to mean to operate or produce by turning a crank. So, something that's going to make a machine operate or be useful. These second, third, and fourth definitions, in my mind, all sort of tie together. Again, as I think about machines and tools and kind of the actions or motions that are being used um, with respect to them. A fifth way you might hear grind used is to mean to work or to study hard. This fifth definition is a bit informal, but people will use it again to really mean they're working pretty hard or extremely hard, not just kind of going through the motions. You should know that grind is an irregular verb. To make the progressive form, all you need to do is add ing to form grinding. The past tense and participle forms of this verb have a different spelling, so I'm going to change the vowel I to the vowels O and U and form the word ground. Okay. Now, you can probably tell here, this looks very familiar. You might be thinking that, oh, that's what I walk on when I'm outside. I walk on the ground. That different meaning, different usage, but the same spelling and the same pronunciation there. Now, let's take a moment to look at some phrasal verbs with grind, and there are actually quite a few. So many that we're going to focus our discussion on that today. We won't do any other individual verb tense practice. Let's start today with the phrasal verb grind away. This ties back to that fifth definition we were talking about moments ago. So, to keep working at something. Again, this tends to imply there's some hard work involved. An example of this: he ground away at perfecting his lyrics and music. Okay? Here's a simple past tense sentence describing somebody who kept working. Another phrasal verb you might hear is to grind away at. Many times this is used to mean that someone is nagging, they're criticizing or disparaging, but really making someone feel pretty down in the dumps, feeling pretty dejected. An example of this: her parents grind away at her, criticizing her grades, behavior, and attitude. Here's an example of a simple present sentence. So I'm describing someone's habit or their routine. These parents, for whatever reason, routinely criticize, they nag, they mention all the things that are wrong about their daughter or their daughter's actions. The next phrasal verb you might hear is grind down. This can have a couple meanings. One might mean to just weaken or destroy something kind of slowly or gradually. An example of this: the pandemic has ground down a lot of people's patience with demanding bosses and toxic environments. So, for many years, people felt like, well, I have to put up with really demanding, rude bosses because I need a job. But now, maybe the pandemic, maybe there are other forces at work here, but people's patience have been weakened. So now people are saying, I quit or I resign. A second way to use grind down just means to reduce something by grinding. An example of this: can you grind down these tree stumps? Right? Sometimes this happens after a bad storm. Right, a tree is blown down in the wind. To remove it can be quite hard. So different tools, devices can be used to turn that wood into mulch. And so we're reducing it from like these big pieces into very tiny parts. Another phrasal verb you might hear is to grind into. Uh, Many times we use this to mean that we are pressing or twisting something very hard into something else. Let me show you an example of that. The child was grinding a crayon into the carpet. Ooh, right? This would be a mess, right? You can kind of picture this though. Um, Crayon or crayon, depending upon what part of the United States you live in, right? Getting pressed really firmly into the carpet as well. So here was grinding a crayon into is an example of the past progressive. So here we're talking about an action that was continuing in the past. And I think I forgot to say my first example with grind down, that was an example of the present perfect. And the second, grind down, reducing something here. Can you grind down these tree stumps? This is a modal where maybe I'm asking about someone's ability. Are you able to help with this action? Now let's continue looking at a few more phrasal verbs. The next one we're going to discuss is grind on. This can have a few different meanings. One would be to proceed relentlessly. So this idea with relentlessly is never giving up. An example of this: the war in Ukraine is grinding on and on. I know I've mentioned this in a few of my videos over the last few months. It's been 5 months now, I think, that this has been going on. So it's continuing. As much as I wish and many others that it would end, it continues to proceed. A second way you might hear grind on used is to mean to talk endlessly. An example of this: does the teacher grind on after the bell rings? Usually the bell is a signal that class is over, it's time to move to your next. But here, someone might be asking their friend, does your teacher continue to talk on and on and on, even after the bell? This question, this yes or no question, I should say, is in the simple present. So we're asking about a habit or a routine. A third way you might hear grind on used is a bit more informal, and it's in reference to a particular type or style of dancing. So the dancing is done really closely. There's a lot of hip movement, and many people would describe it as being kind of aggressive as well. So I'm not going to demonstrate that in a video. You don't need an old middle-aged teacher to do that for you. Instead, let's take a look at an example sentence. They don't enjoy dance clubs because they don't want strangers grinding on them. Okay, so here in this sentence, we're referring to people being really physically close as they dance. And I want to note in my sentence here, I'm not using grinding on here exactly as a verb, right? My verb in the second part of the sentence after because is want. But I still wanted to point this meaning out. I think it is really very common to hear grinding on used as a gerund, and that's what I'm using as what I'm using it as in this particular sentence. So I'm describing an activity. Next, let's take another look. A phrasal verb, grind out, could mean that we are producing something with great difficulty. Here's an example of that. The team ground out a win yesterday. So sometimes I feel like I hear this used in connection with sports. So we might be describing an athlete, or we could be describing a team. And when sportscasters use this, they're generally referring to this wasn't easy. They weren't ahead at the beginning and like easily kept the lead, right? They had to work really hard to eventually win the game. The last phrasal verb we'll look at is to grind up. This ties back to the first definition of the verb we looked at earlier. So we're reducing something into very tiny pieces. An example of this: he grinds up coffee beans each morning. Here, grinds up is an example of the simple present. So again, I'm describing someone's habit or routine. Now, let's take a moment to look at some words and phrases related to our verb grind. And the first word we're going to look at is just the noun form of this word. So, it has the exact same spelling, the exact same pronunciation. When I use the noun grind, I might be referring to a crushing sound or a crushing motion. Another way some people use that is grating as well. So, an example of this: can you hear the grind of the machines? A second way you'll hear the noun grind used is to refer to hard work. Usually it's unpleasant, it's not very exciting. This can also be a bit informal, so I would be careful using this sentence at work. But if you're talking to your family or your friends, you could absolutely say, "Oh, work has been such a grind this week. It's been really hard. Maybe it's been boring, maybe it's been both at the same time." The next word we're going to look at is the noun grinder. This is a machine that's used for grinding something. So, an example of this: do you own a coffee grinder or a pepper grinder? I think those are some of the most commonly used ones in people's homes. Now, in certain parts of the United States, though, you'll also hear people talk about a grinder when they're in cafeterias or restaurants. And they're referring to a particular type of sandwich. I've got a picture here. You might know this as a sub or submarine sandwich. It gets used very similarly. So I wasn't too familiar with it, but where I went to college, this was something that was frequently on the menu. So people would say things like, the cafeteria is serving grinders today. The last phrase we're going to take a look at today is grind to a halt. So this is where something gradually slows down or it loses momentum and then it stops altogether. An example of this in a sentence might be, traffic grinds to a halt about 5 miles down the road. Okay, so we might be warning someone, right? It's getting cars, other vehicles, they're slowing down, and eventually nobody's going to be moving on the highway or the interstate, wherever you might be driving. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.